Well, today we're in Psalm 109, and this is really a difficult prayer, and I think that most Christian people are hesitant to pray this kind of prayer. In the Psalms, it's called an imprecatory prayer. That is, where the prayer is addressed to God to get rid of the enemies and not just eliminate them, but to do them great harm. And it's hard to imagine that we would get up in the morning and pray, you see, against somebody for God to take them out. And so we're hesitant. I mean, we're hesitant to pray this kind of prayer. We sort of have a hunch that it's not right to do it. And yet, much of the Psalms, in fact, nearly a third of the Psalms are imprecatory prayers, and that's not counting some of that that's in the other prayers. And so it's a challenging prayer when we begin to think about praying against the enemy for God to punish them that do evil. And so we need to take a deep look at this, and I'm certain that we can't unpack it today. It's just too much. But let's begin in a moment in verse number 1. Now, let me say something else as you, especially if you read this psalm. It's probably the most graphic imprecatory psalm in the book of Psalms. But I think also if we were to experience some of the things that the psalmist is experiencing, it might not be as difficult as we think to pray this prayer. We kind of live in a bubble in our country. We're not afflicted or persecuted. That's not to say there isn't evil in the land, but nobody's confiscating our property. Nobody's persecuting us, putting us behind bars, killing us. We're not in hiding. We're not living under oppression. We actually live in a very great country. And so we're not really being persecuted physically. We're not starving to death. So it's very difficult because we don't have it like they had it, going through some dark, horrible, ugly times. And I think if we were living in parts of the world today where evil was confronting us, it's on our front door, we might find this just a little bit easier to pray a prayer like this. And so what I'm suggesting to you is we have it rather relatively soft in comparison to some places in the world. If we found ourselves some places in the land, we'd be in some terrible jeopardy. So let's begin here in Psalm chapter 109. And let me just preface it a little bit more just to kind of give you a feel for this. I don't know if you've ever been falsely accused, you've been slandered, your reputation has been ruined. People are spreading venomous untruths about you. They've done you some harm, perhaps somebody at work or even a close friend. And so if you've gone through some of this, you'll get a little bit of the feeling here of what the psalmist was experienced. And then I must say this also, and I know it's hard to really get into all of what's going on here in the psalm today, but it goes beyond personal boundaries. And what I mean by that is what's going on in David's life. He has some folks that are really going against him, but there seems to be one that's predominantly going against him. Perhaps it was Saul that he has in mind, or Ahithophel, as you read over in 2 Samuel 16. But then it goes beyond the borders of anything just personal. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is what you see here is high treason against the state. David is the king. He's on the throne. And to overthrow the throne would put the nation in jeopardy. The throne brought security and safety to the nation. And so it's actually going beyond that. Now, that brings me to something else, if I don't even get into the psalm as much as I want to today. If I were to ask you who was the most important person that's ever been betrayed, what was the greatest threat in the universe against the treason of the sovereignty of God, who was falsely accused and yet did not take personal vengeance, did not seek to get even with his enemies, but trusted in the Lord to take care of it. Think about that for just a moment. So let's read just a few verses today, because I'm already going beyond what I thought I would. Psalm 105, rather 9, he says to the Lord in the old King James, hold not your peace, don't remain silent, literally. He wants God to act. And then he goes on to say, oh God, I praise for them. Now here's what you got going here. What you're going to see in these first few verses is the character of these men and the manner of deceit, that is, their deceitful ways. And just let me say this, when you get down to verse number 18, he talks about how they clothe themselves in wickedness. Their garments are wickedness, but it gets right down to the bones. What's he saying there? He's simply saying that these people had become completely wicked by the ways that they were doing evil. Kind of reminds me sometimes, you get out there caught in a thunderstorm, and you sometimes will say, I'm wet right down to the bones. And this is what had happened. These people had become so hardened, so sinful, so wicked, that it actually became them. And that's what we're dealing with here. Notice here, the mouth of the wicked are deceitful and opened up against me. They have spoken against me with lying tongues. They have compassed me. That is, they surrounded me with words of hatred. That's their motive. They're malicious people. They have no reason to hate David, but they're just downright scoundrels. And he says here, and they fought against me without cause. There was no reason for them to do that. In verse number 4, notice here, for my love, they are my adversaries, but I give myself unto prayer, and they have rewarded evil for good and hatred for my love. Look at that. They're close to them. David had actually prayed for them, and he done good to them, and they have done evil to him. But I want you to notice something very important in verse number 4. In all of this, David turned to God in prayer, and that's what we need to do, don't we? I mean, when things aren't going well, when we're being faced with adversity and we have adversaries, our first step ought to be, to pray to the Lord. Now notice here, the wicked men in verse number 6 are over him. Let's Satan, that's not what we really want to translate here, just the accuser, these false accusers. That's what the word Satan meant anyhow. The word Satan referred to an accuser, but I don't think he's referring to the devil himself here. Stand at his right hand. And then notice this, when he shall be judged, let him be condemned, and let his prayer become sin. Now, what you're going to see here is some very graphic things that David begins to say, and I'm going to let you read that today just because of our brevity of time. But what David will do is ask God to appoint someone to take care of this fella. In other words, David will not take it into his own hands, but God will use somebody to deal with these wicked, evil people. And so this is something of the imprecatory prayer. I wish we could spend more time on it, but it's just too much to get into in a very brief moment that we have today. But it's right to have imprecatory prayers. We ought to be praying to God about the evil that's going on and pray against some of the wickedness that has permeated the land, things that are wrong and things that are wrong in themselves. And you have to be careful, because the modern church has become so liberal that sometimes there's more sympathy for the victim rather for the criminal than the victim. Let's make sure we got that one right. I mean, sometimes there happens to be more empathy and sympathy for the guy who's the criminal who done the evil act than the poor fellow who was the victim. And that's something that we ought to really think about, because in the psalm here, David is wanting God for justice, and he talks about how this is an appropriate action and this person deserves to be punished. And that's sort of going out of the land today, hasn't it? So there's a lot in this psalm. I hope you'll read it. It's a tough psalm. It's a tough prayer. But I want you to remember something here. These were Hebrew hymns that were in corporate worship. But if you get down to verse 8, I'll just mention this for you to study it a little bit further. Let his days be few. In other words, let him be dead and let another take his office. Now, if you're a Bible student, you know that that's quoted over in Acts chapter 1 in verse 20 when they're praying to God for that, to replace Judas, who was an evil man. And so we're going to let it go at that, and I hope that this will really challenge you, won't it, when we really start to think about praying against the evil that's in the nation, and it's evil against God, and hate the evil that's going on. So those are some thoughts, or challenging thoughts, but boy, that's the Bible, and we need to believe everything. We just can't pick and choose what we like, but we need to be right with everything the Bible says. See you tomorrow.